Right now, Canada is building more homes than ever before, but they're not the kind most people want or most people can afford or that most people even end up living in. Single family home construction is hitting generational lows. Meanwhile, we see condos keep piling up unsold, rental construction absolutely exploding. And at the same time, we are really seeing population growth collapse. Confidence is near historic lows, and even land ownership is now in question in British Columbia and even other provinces. And if that wasn't all enough, the federal government's so called housing solution may have just been announced in front of a fake construction site. So I guess that begs the question, what is really being built in Canada and who is it actually for? That's what we're going to break down in today's episode. So let's start it off right here. The dramatic shift in the types of homes that are being built in our country continues to be a topic that we want to bring to the forefront. While total units under construction are basically sitting at an all-time high, it's the breakdown of those unit types and those housing types that really warrants further investigation. When you take out all the rentals that are under construction, homeowner starts continue to fall and are now sitting down at 2009 levels. If we take out the dip that we saw during the global financial crisis, homeowner starts are now slower than they were 25 years ago. And that's not adjusted for population growth. Over just the past 3 months, single family home starts are down 9.1%, condo starts are down 11.3%. And by contrast, those purpose built rentals are absolutely booming. They're up 33%. Looking at building permits next, which obviously lead starts by upwards of 2, 3, even 4 years. Well, Ontario and British Columbia just hit a 40-year low in those single family home building permits. This will lead to a pretty dramatic shortage of that housing type down the road. And it helps demonstrate the shift that's ultimately taking place within our country. Fewer and fewer people are going to be living in single family homes. And the current trajectory is that the majority of people will end up moving into rental units over the coming years. And this is based almost purely on supply. When that property type is continually to be almost overbuilt, well, it's going to make rental rates more and more attractive and ultimately move more and more people into those types of homes. So when we look at the numbers a little bit closer, there are 180,000 rental units in the construction pipeline across Canada, with 16% of BC's entire rental stock currently under construction today. In 2012, there were around 2,000 rentals under construction at any time during that year. Fast forward to today, that is now 35,000. Big numbers. And of course, the Build Canada Homes program, well, it's focused entirely on bringing even more rentals to the market. The vacancy rate in Canada hit a low of about 1.5% back in 2024, and it's already climbed up to 2.5% today. Keep watching this space because I think the vacancy rate will likely push well into the fours in the coming years. It's not great for the mom and pop investors out there, and definitely not great news for institutional investors. So a quick update on what's happening with current rental rates. One bedroom rents fell in November after a bit of a seasonal lift that we saw last month in October. One bedroom unfurnished rates in Metro Vancouver now average $2,164 per month. That's down almost $60 from the previous month, and rents are now down 9% from where they were 1 year ago. West Van remains the most expensive area, sitting at about $2,520 a month. And 17 of Canada's largest metros have rental rates down on a year-over-year basis. This is not focused just in Vancouver or BC. It is happening across most major metros in the nation. So the types of homes that Canadians will live in looks to be shifting quite dramatically over the years. We're going to definitely continue to update this space because I think the percentage of people living in homes they own is going to decrease quite notably.
What's that line? You will own nothing and be happy somehow. Um, Anyhow, let's move on here. Canada quietly took another step in its housing strategy this past weekend, releasing new details on its Build Canada Homes program, or BCH, a federal initiative intended to tackle the country's worsening affordability crisis. And while the new framework finally provides some clarity on what the program is meant to do, it also exposes some troubling limitations That raises serious questions about its ability to meaningfully move the needle. Build Canada Homes is designed to partner with nonprofits, municipalities, Indigenous groups, and private builders to create affordable and mixed income housing, primarily on federally owned land. The government has confirmed three key goals for the program. First, finance, using public dollars to attract private and institutional investment. Don't know how well that's going to go, but we'll see. Second, build, accelerating development and lowering construction costs. And third, industrialize, pushing innovation like factory built housing, mass timber, and standardized designs. It's not, however, focused on market rate housing or middle class ownership. It's aimed squarely at affordable rentals and social housing. And here's where the concern begins. The program strongly encourages the use of CMHC's standardized design catalog. Sounds efficient, but those designs are mostly 1 to 3 story buildings. So, in other words, they're low rise, low density housing. At a time when cities are desperately trying to densify and when Canada has a serious shortage of 3 bedroom and single family houses, they're prioritizing small, low density homes. This is a very puzzling decision. In fact, only a small fraction of the designs in the catalog include 3 or more bedrooms. Another major issue: innovation versus volume of homes. Build Canada Homes emphasizes modern construction methods, meaning prefabrication, modular design, rapid assembly, and all of that sounds great in theory. But innovative methods almost always cost more in the beginning. That means fewer homes will get built on a per dollar basis. And the framework doesn't clearly explain how the government will balance that trade off. Innovation on one side and actual housing volume on the other. Even more concerning is the lack of support for early stage innovation. There is no dedicated funding stream within the BCH to support new building technology. Instead, companies are directed elsewhere for support, creating what many in the industry have called the valley of death, where promising technologies die before you can even scale them up. And on top of that, regulatory barriers remain almost entirely unaddressed. You can invent a safer, more efficient building system, but if building codes and zoning rules don't allow it, it's dead on arrival. So in some cities, it's actually illegal to build proven housing forms that are used all over Europe, as example. Not because they're unsafe, but because the local rules can't keep up with these new ideas. And BCH doesn't appear to include any meaningful plan to modernize these rules. It's like the left hand just not knowing what the right hand is doing. Now, to be fair, there is a bright spot. For the first time in federal housing policy, the government has offered a clear income-based definition of affordability, broken into specific tiers based on local incomes. That kind of clarity is badly needed and well overdue. The problem, though, is its sort of clarity without clear outcomes. It's not enough. So experts are warning the program may become oversubscribed, spreading money thinly across many different projects without actually improving the housing affordability or reducing homelessness in any kind of meaningful way. In short, Build Canada Homes is a step in the right direction, but right now it feels like ready, fire, aim. Until there's more focused on national strategy, clear targets, modernized regulations, and a meaningful innovation support, Canada's housing crisis isn't going to get solved this way. Build Canada Homes may help, but on its own, it's nowhere near enough.
And should be renamed Build Canada Rental Homes, apparently, because again, they have basically glossed over during their campaigns that, while building affordable homes, in nowhere did they mention they were just building what was going to be affordable rental homes, not affordable homes for end users, unfortunately. And this is all coming to light. Perhaps people are getting a little bit upset about this because home ownership is not being addressed by the current federal government. But let's look now at more of a municipal look, because We talked a lot last week about sort of the NIMBYism pushback and some of the cities and municipalities that are kind of doing their best to prevent densification and not adopt things like the multiplex plan. But North Vancouver has just passed an omnibus of bylaw changes that should help multiplex buildings be constructed. Just ahead of the December 31st deadline imposed by the provincial government, North Vancouver has updated their bylaws in an attempt to tighten the current gap of approximately 6,500 new home shortfall over the next 20 years. For developers, investors, and homeowners tracking the legislative changes mandated by BC's housing policy, the city of North Vancouver has just provided the highest degree of regulatory certainty, well, at least to date. So under these new rules, just under about 4,300 properties east of St. Andrews Ave and west of Mahon Avenue will be eligible for up to 4 units to be built now. Another 600 or so single-family lots in between those boundaries could have up to 6 units built on them. The heritage homes along the Grand Boulevard area and East 19th and East 10th Streets will be exempt to give the city more time to study options that balance heritage preservation with the need for new housing. So prior to this vote, council heard from members of the public, of course, and almost all of them urged city council to go ahead with the changes, but to also not let the council's design guidelines get in the way of new homes being built, right? You got to, like Ryan mentioned, have the right hand, talk to the left hand, and make sure everything is aligned here. So will this actually result in more homes being built in North Vancouver? Well, one builder reading and reviewing these new bylaws noticed that the bylaws for a multiplex suggested only about a 10% increase in the total floor space ratio that is allowed compared to just single family homes. So what does that mean? Well, builders will be unlikely to increase the number of units per lot. And instead, well, they're just going to build larger units, meaning that, they're probably going to end up with larger duplexes instead of a fourplex. This basically means that there won't likely be a big and dramatic increase in the number of units that are actually built, but more an increase in the price of homes that are being built because, of course, they're larger, right? Instead of 2,000 square foot duplexes, for example, well, now they're going to build them at 2,200 square feet each. And that'll obviously, on a per foot base, push up the price. The FSR increase does not sound like it is significant enough that people may actually turn those 2 units into 3 or ideally 4. Now, when will this come into play? Well, final adoption and mapping is projected for Q1 2026, so coming up pretty quick here. But the largest unknown is the final FSR allowance. So ideally, it gets pushed up to be a lot more than 10% above a single family home to ultimately allow for densification to take place in that city.
Interesting. Yeah. Now let's touch on a sector of the industry that continues to get battered, and that's unsold developer inventory. When nothing sells, obviously the inventory builds, and Toronto new home sales hit a record low for the 13th straight month last month, and it had the weakest October ever. Only 570 units sold last month, down 29% from last year and 81% below the 10-year average. The city of Toronto saw a whopping 54 condo sales in all of last month. We're talking the entire city of Toronto. This is resulting in a massive increase in unsold inventory. Last month saw the largest reported monthly increase in completed and unsold developer inventory dating back to 1990. Most of that increase came out of Vancouver, where unsold inventory has just hit a 25-year high. Vancouver has now over 5,000 newly completed and unsold inventory sitting on developer balance sheets.
Well, yeah, and of course, which developer is going to launch a new project into that environment? It just doesn't make economical sense, right? And we're seeing it in real time, right? Last week we talked about how another project had to get flipped into rental units only because they could not hit their sales targets for end users. And something else, of course, that is going to dramatically affect these units continuing not to sell is population growth or the lack of. And so I guess the question then shifts to who is ultimately going to buy these homes? Who's going to absorb all this unsold inventory? And who's going to rent these record amount of rental units that are coming to the market? With rents falling and provincial legislation making investment properties less and less attractive, you need ultimately population growth to absorb some of this inventory. And that's not coming either, at least not in the near future. Ben Rabideau has an incredible metric to track population growth, and he looks at the net mobile phone user additions at Canadian telcos, right? If new people come to the country, what's the first thing they typically do? They get a phone. So it's a great way and a really intelligent way to track immigration and population growth, especially. Q3 reports, when we look at these Canadian telcos, they show net additions down 41% year over year and down about 71% compared to 2023. Year over year population growth for Canada is on track for roughly 315,000 people by the time 2025 washes out. So outside of COVID era, when obviously the doors were closed, this was the lowest amount, or this will be the lowest amount of population growth going back 70 years, which is all as far back as the data goes. And remember, the federal mandate is now in place to slow population growth even further, going negative into 2026 and likely 2027. So negative population growth, put that against a record amount of units under construction. Pretty hard to argue that prices and rental rates are heading anywhere but down in the immediate future.
Yeah, let's touch on the cost of living too. With it ever increasing and mortgage renewals seeing more money paid into housing, consumer deposits into banks, it actually continues to drop dramatically. Deposits lowered by 0.7% month over month in September, and that's the second largest decline in 13 years. Annual growth rates sit at just 0.4%. That's the weakest since 2013. This is showing up now in retail spending. And retail activity across Canada continues to show signs of strain heading into the all-important holiday shopping season. According to StatsCan, retail sales fell 0.7% in September to just under $70 billion. From a real estate perspective, this slowdown in retail activity is a sign that consumer confidence remains fragile. It highlights how higher living costs, from mortgages to food prices, are squeezing household budgets, which in turn affects everything from discretionary spending to housing demand. And what's more is that HELOCs right now are being tapped into the highest rate since 2013. Drawn balances hit just 4.1%. It's not a devastating amount, but the trend is worth mentioning because it further demonstrates how stretched financially Canadians are and what they're doing to survive. Consumer insolvencies just hit a 16-year high, with 13,000 consumers filing for either bankruptcy or a consumer proposal in September. September also saw the second highest number of filings for any month in 2019. Total insolvencies are up 10% year over year in Canada, but a massive 40% in BC alone. This is hitting an all-time record high dating back to 2007.
So all these factors and all these headlines that are showing how strained Canadians are, it's really affecting consumer confidence. Consumer confidence lowered again last month, and it sits now lower than it did during the global financial crisis. And it's sitting today basically the same level as it did during the COVID shutdown, when life was very uncertain. That's emulating how people feel today when it comes to confidence. And the real estate confidence outlook is not much better. That sits at the fourth lowest area it is or has been in the last 7 years, with only worse times being, of course, COVID again, when mortgage rates hit 7%, and the onset of the trade war. So today, confidence it's basically one of the biggest drivers in real estate, or the lack of real estate sales, and it's resulting in continued low levels of sales volumes nationally. And until something very dramatic shifts within confidence, then I think, again, we're going to continue to see these sluggish sales because, as a reminder, interest rates are at about the same place they were in 2022. And that's when we saw sales volumes 50% higher. So this clearly demonstrates that it's not just interest rates being, of course, the main driver of real estate sales, but now confidence is one of the main players in the arena.
Okay, let's get into some politics here. Last month, Mark Carney stood in front of what looked like an active construction site in suburban Ottawa and announced the federal government's new housing agency, Build Canada Homes, was talking about before. With half-finished structures behind him and equipment nearby, the message was pretty clear. Action's finally happening. We're building. But according to newly released government documents, the entire site was staged. In response to questioning from Conservative MP, the Privy Council office has now confirmed that the backdrop for that announcement was not a real housing development at all, but a carefully constructed demonstration created specifically for the media. In reality, the structures behind the Prime Minister were modular units temporarily assembled for the announcement. They were never intended to be part of any kind of permanent housing project on that particular piece of land. One unit was placed on the site for optics. It then disassembled and shipped north to Nunavut, where it's now on its way to being occupied by a family. Another set of stacked townhomes was taken apart and repurposed for a development in eastern Ottawa. Meanwhile, the gravel lot itself, lacking any kind of buried utilities, services, roads, or any kind of infrastructure that would be typical of any kind of housing development, remains completely empty. A few days after the press conference, the so-called housing site was stripped down. The units were gone, replaced by an excavator and a bulldozer grading the dirt. And that's about when the backlash started. Critics quickly compared the scene to a modern-day Potemkin village, a fake setup built to project the illusion of progress as opposed to progress itself. To make matters worse, it's now been confirmed that taxpayers footed the bill for the photo op. It was just $32,000 for a few minutes. The modular home company involved, Caven, said that they were approached to help demonstrate the prototype build and insist it was never meant to be misunderstood as an active development. They argue the homes were part of their regular pre-production process and have since been put to real use elsewhere. But the concern isn't whether or not the homes were real. It's that the story being told to Canadians wasn't. Neither the Prime Minister nor the Housing Minister clarified during the event that the site was purely a demonstration. The public was left with the impression that the new community was already rising out of the ground. For a country facing the deepening housing affordability crisis that we have and growing distrust in political messaging, optics matter, and so does transparency. And moments like this don't just hurt credibility, they distract from the real work that needs to be done and the real conversations that need to be having. Instead, we're having this. If the government wants Canadians to believe that it has the solutions for the housing crisis, these photo ops are not enough.
And now on to what will likely be an almost weekly update on Indigenous land claims. And today we're having a specific update on the Cowichan land ruling in Richmond, and almost inevitable, I guess, path forward for some. Because what's happened now is a Burnaby homeowner is launching a proposed class action lawsuit against both the province of British Columbia and the federal government. And this class action suit claims that the recent Cowichan Tribe's ruling has created uncertainty around private property ownership across the entire province. And, ultimately, it's not wrong at all. This is something that most people are talking about, and definitely many within our circles. The claimant, J.R. Gruel, says a recent BC Supreme Court decision, which granted the Aboriginal title to portions of land in Richmond, that's been well documented and discussed recently, well, it could have far-reaching consequences for homeowners well beyond just that area. The decision is currently being appealed by the province, the federal government, the city of Richmond, and even the Musqueam and Tsawwassen First Nations. Now, the court had ruled, of course, that the Aboriginal title can coexist with fee simple ownership, the type of title held by, of course, most private property owners in Canada. So while the Cowichan tribes have stated that they're not attempting to displace homeowners or take control of privately owned homes at this time, the ruling does, in fact, leave open the possibility that this could be pursued in the future though through negotiation or further legal action. So again, just saying that you're not going to remove people from their land, but having full authority to do so does not give enough confidence for these homeowners. So Gruel's proposed lawsuit, well, it seeks class action status on behalf of British Columbians who believe that their property values, their ability to refinance, to sell, or access equity may be negatively impacted by the uncertainty created from the unresolved Indigenous land claims. And it's far beyond belief, right? At this point, we're hearing all sorts of stories that, no, of course, banks are on hold for considering offering mortgages on someone who would perhaps buy a piece of land, a home, a condo within this land claim area. So the claim argues that governments were aware of the risks tied to outstanding title issues, but continued to assure the public that registered land titles were secure, all while collecting property taxes, fees, and transfer costs based on those values. So the lawsuit here, it's going to seek compensation for loss of value, emotional distress, missed investment opportunities, and even the return of certain taxes and fees. Something we discussed last week that may be something that, of course, homeowners in these areas would want. So in response, the BC government says land titles across the province remain valid and emphasize that the Cowichan claim covers a very specific area, roughly 150 properties in Richmond, including city and federally owned lands, farms, a golf course, and commercial parcels. So the court ultimately ruled that some municipal and federal land ownership was invalid and ordered the province to negotiate a settlement with the Cowichan, but did not overturn private land titles. You can see that this is only becoming more and more complex and convoluted and, well, what will likely be very drawn out. So even so, the decision acknowledges that uncertainty may now exist for some property owners. The key takeaway here, I think, is that while no private homeowner has technically lost their title, at least not yet, the case obviously raises very serious questions about long-term certainty of land ownership in BC and could set a precedent for how Indigenous land claims impact private property in our future. So as housing policy, land use, and Indigenous rights continue to all collide at once, this is a story that every homeowner and investor and company in BC are watching quite closely. So as it unfolds each week, each month, we'll keep updating as often as we can. And it's one of the potential biggest shifts that could ever happen in land and home ownership in our country.
Well, yeah, the only thing I'll add is, I find it comical that we're being told that an Aboriginal title can coexist with a fee simple ownership at the same time when they are in direct conflict with one another. It's very clear. I actually did some digging on this. The Aboriginal title is considered superior and prior to that of a fee simple ownership. So that would mean then that it would be of more value or higher value, stronger in a legal framework than the fee simple ownership that you have if you own your home. And so I don't know how these two things can exist at the same time. They don't, when one is clearly defined as superior and prior to the other. So they don't coexist. One is going to have an Aboriginal title, and it's going to be like a leasehold land. It's very, very clear in that legal definition. And I think one thing too that a lot of Canadians don't understand is we also don't have absolute property rights, like say down in the US. In Canada, the Crown owns everything, and they could expropriate your land if they so chose. But now you're going to have the Crown, then Aboriginal title, then fee simple. So if there's not a lot of security here for people, and I can understand why there's a class action lawsuit, because we're also being told things by the government that they can exist at the same time, when if you really look at the legal framework and you speak to lawyers about this, they can't. And it's going to get so messy, and I think you're just going to see people hands off, and I'm excited to see the fact that somebody's actually going after the government for this, because I really think this is the government's screw up more than it is anything else.
That is it for this week's episode. Thanks as always for tuning in and watching. Have a great weekend, and we will see you here next week. Thanks.